Hello everyone, my name is Enda. I'm a Professor of Air Quality and Carbon Management based at the University of the West of England in Bristol. Many thanks to the organisers for inviting me along today to discuss public engagement and citizen behaviour and to consider whether it's a new frontier for air quality management. As a little bit of context, I'm the director of a research group called the Air Quality Management Resource Centre, and we look a lot at how we can move the conversation around air pollution and indeed around carbon emissions away from being a very technocentric conversation to try and ensure that we talk about people's day-to-day lives, day-to-day activities, day-to-day practices. And then by creating these new insights, we can then use this information in terms of better public engagement activities. So the first question is really, is it a new frontier? And the answer to that is to some extent it's not. We've already got long-standing legislation and guidelines in place that require us to engage with the public. The Aarhus Convention of '98, Air Quality Directives for 2008, policy and technical guidance here in the UK. And that all requires us to provide access to information for the public and to ensure that the public are participating in these in decision-making processes. But the reality is the implementation of this legislation and guidelines means that it's common practice to provide information and it's common practice to consult with the public. But it tends to be very time limited, and it tends to be often a one-way conversation. So we need to think about how we can do it differently to ensure that people become much more engaged in the conversation. And we also need to think about it within the context of a shifting landscape. We've seen a growing environmentalism and a growing activism. This can be, if you want, the Greta Thunberg effect, Extinction Rebellion, Client Earth, and even the publication of the IPCC report last week. We've seen an uplift in the public debate around these air pollution, carbon and climate challenges. But also we need to think about how different demographics can access information. For example, there's already evidence out there that says people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds often have difficulties in accessing the data which is already available. And finally, we need to think about change in pathways to evidence. We've seen more and more citizen science. We see more low-cost sensors coming on board. We see the immediacy of accessing information through social media. So ultimately we have to ask our questions as an air quality and indeed a scientific community. Do we still have a meaningful influence on the narrative, or actually are we bystanders in a new wave of environmentalism? And in doing so, we have to look at the way that policy, research and the media works and if we've actually failed. Certainly when we think about it from the perspective of air pollution and indeed from the perspective of carbon and climate, there's a poor perception of risk in that issues are often presented in very abstract forms, and there's often a psychological distance in terms of the consequences of these and when they might actually happen. For example, in air pollution, we often talk about 40,000 premature deaths due to air pollution every year in the UK. But these aren't real deaths, these are statistical deaths, which makes the public's perception of the problem quite challenging. We often talk about negative framing of the problem in terms of higher taxation, reduced consumption, low quality of life, and we need to think about how we can frame these challenges in a more positive manner. And really some of the main issues around the contextualization of the debate and how we can connect the data to people's real world lived experiences, but how we can do it without overwhelming people and actually frightening them. And that's something that we've tried to do in terms of moving this shift from very technocentric to a more people-orientated debate. So when we think about public engagement, there's usually three dimensions of engagement: transmit, receive and collaborate. Transmit and receive is something that we already do: put information on a website, push it out there, let people engage with it as they see fit. Receive is something we already do. This is where we might have consultations, but these are often very time limited and tend to be, again, a very one-way conversation. And also the exciting point, I suppose, is collaborate. And this is where we can have meaningful bottom-up engagement processes whereby we bring the public in beside the science, in beside the policy, and we actually have a true kind of co-creation and co-design process. And in doing so, you get a huge amount of extra value in terms of people taking more ownership of the problems, and indeed then taking more ownership of the solutions going forward. And this is something we tried to do through a project called Clear City. If we think about the way we traditionally manage air pollution, we tend to look at it from the perspective of the where and the what. So the where being the geographical or the spatial areas where we have poor air quality and where we might have relevant exposure, and the what being the sources of that pollution: cars, buses, HGVs, solid fuel burning, aviation, industry, etc. So what we've tried to do in the Clear City project is move away from the where and the what and start to look towards the who and the why. So looking at different demographics, age, income, gender, looking at the reasons why they might generate pollution: driving to work, taking kids to school, leisure time, shopping. And when you do that, you can actually have a very, very different conversation people, because they start to connect to their day-to-day lives and their day-to-day experiences. Now, this is an example of an infographic that was used by Bristol City Council to apportion pollution by different vehicle types and by different fuels. But actually, when you go and talk to the public about air pollution, you realize that they don't talk about cars, buses, and HGVs, or they don't talk about different fuel types. They talk about things like accessibility, flexibility, reliability, affordability. These are all the social factors that influence how they behave. And indeed, this one quote here, I think, sums it up very nicely, in that one of our citizens said, "What do I know about Euro standards? I just drive to the shops." So we have to move away from this very technocentric conversation and actually have a conversation that involves people and people in the data. And this is one of the things that we did in Clear City, is that we actually started to take emissions and we started to break them down by age, by income level, and by gender. And we start to break the emissions down by things like leisure time, shopping, commuting, businesses. Now that allows then local authorities to calibrate their policies and to calibrate their action plans and their strategies, not only for technology, but also for people and people's behavior and different age groups and different income groups and different gender groups and different purposes or motives or activities. It allows us to create policies that are much more citizen-centered and much more citizen-focused and inclusive. And then you can actually start to have fun with it. Again, this is a game that we created whereby you're the citizen of, or you're the mayor of the city, and you have to make policy decisions that would have an effect on air pollution, carbon emissions, people satisfaction, the city economy. And we can use these sort of public engagement activities to kind of crowdsource the public acceptability of different policy options and look at what decisions different demographics start to make, and look at how, for example, male versus female players tend to choose either more technocentric policy options or tend to choose more kind of, shall we say, softer, more behavioral focused options. So these sort of immersive engagement activities tend to break down a lot of doors and a lot of barriers. And finally, I wanted to reflect on the value of citizen science. There's often three viewpoints when we look at citizen science. Number one, not our business. Citizens can do it for themselves. We're not going to get engaged with it. Viewpoint is often number two, is that it's annoying because it can create problems, create nasty questions, generate data which is inaccurate, has problems with interpretation. Our viewpoint number three is that it's great fun, count us in, and that you get, once you invest, you actually get great results beyond just the data. But with any citizen science project, there's real tasks for the scientific community in terms of explaining the data, ensuring quality, making it available, providing context, and really importantly, from my perspective, is the interpretation of that data. so that we actually get used in a sensible manner. And I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves about citizen science is how do we ensure that we convert citizen scientists into citizen advocates or policymakers? And that's one of the things we're trying to do in a project called We Count, where we are working with citizens to count traffic using this low-cost sensor in their window. And you can see great value starting to come out of the data in terms of traffic volumes, road safety, air pollution, noise. There's a multitude of different reasons why you can, or different outputs in terms of using this data. But it isn't just the data, it's also the value of, again, that local context, the qualitative evidence to back up the quantitative evidence that it might create. So is public engagement and citizen behaviour a new frontier? Not necessarily, but I would argue that this kind of collaborative, co-design, citizen-inclusive approach is certainly a new frontier and one that adds huge value. Behaviour, not about the society, but or not about the individual, but it's certainly about the society and how it functions and how it influences our behaviour. The collaboration approach allows us to work towards joint decision making and gives people a better sense of ownership of not only the problem but also the solutions. By actually looking at people's behavior, we can target enabling policies so that greener choices become the social norm for everyone. But certainly when we're engaging with the public, we have to know our audience, connect to their lived experience, find common ground, and if you invest the time, you will certainly reap the benefits. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.